Yeah.
Hello, hello. Does that work?
Yeah, it works good.
Okay,
Woo!
good.
Yeah. Well, I want to introduce everybody to Manuel Bojorquez.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
A little bit about Manuel. Manuel is a national correspondent for CBS News, and he's based out of Miami and travels all over the country to do stories. He is here today because we have a mutual friend whom I worked with at WCCO TV and who has worked with Manny because he works for CBS News. And so we were here last night and we sent him, I sent him an email and said he was okay.
And he didn't write back like he was surprised or anything. He just said, oh, okay.
Yeah, he said, well, he's really nice, and it's so nice of him to come up here.
He was trying to be nice about it.
I know. So we like to prank. I think
yes, we do.
That's fairly common in news just because of the stress of the business. So, Manny, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay. First of all, thank you for having me. It's great to be here with all of you, and I see some of the faces from the night before too. So you already know a little bit about me, but I was born in El Salvador in 1979, which is the year that the war started, and my family decided that it was, like many other families, time to go. So in 1980, my father was already working in Los Angeles. My mother decided that she would take my two older sisters, who were 8 and 10, and me as a 1.5-year-old little baby through the dangerous trek up through Mexico and across the border. And I won't bore anybody with the details, but it was not the most fun experience for her. It was very dangerous. It was very treacherous, but we somehow made it. And we were, because of special circumstances, you can't really do this anymore. There was amnesty extended through the Reagan administration. We were able to apply to become legal residents. And then when I was 18, to become a US citizen. So here I am now. I was very blessed and fortunate to have a family that was very, they really wanted to stress the importance of education in our lives and are trying to make something happen, they sacrificed a lot to give us the ability to make something of our lives. I was lucky to get a scholarship to USC. I decided, as you know, staying at home in 1992 during the LA riots for a week and watching nonstop TV coverage, that's what I wanted to do for a living. At that moment, I thought, that's kind of cool. I can't go out there, but these people can, and they're at the forefront of history here. And so here I am, working for CBS News, based in Miami, and getting to cover the domestic side, which is anything from natural disasters to politics, which kind of is a natural disaster of its own. And the beauty of what I've been able to do is continue this tradition of foreign reporting at CBS News, but doing a little bit more in Latin America with my background, being able to just connect with people and to try to keep those stories at the forefront. I think it's so important. We don't cover it enough. And as you know, there's so much going on there, good and bad, that we need to pay attention to.
So how did you get to the network? You don't just go, hey, I think I'll work at CBS News.
No. I knew I always wanted to get to the network level because I wanted to have the experiences of traveling to different places, cities, states, and abroad. The selfish part of me that wanted to travel on the company dime, right? Although they get your pound of flesh out of, they get it out of you one way or the other. I started in local news. First job was in Palm Springs, California, right out of college, making $10 an hour, and that was actually good. I knew friends who were making $8 an hour in Missoula, Montana. But that's how it starts. You start small, you make very little money. And then if you prove to them that you can do it, they'll keep you, or you keep jumping up to a bigger market. I was fortunate enough to go from Palm Springs to Phoenix, and Phoenix is a good-sized market. There's a lot of breaking news, good live experience, good storytelling, and I loved any time that we could go outside of Phoenix to cover stories. I always had that urge to want to do something outside of where I was. From there, I went to Atlanta at WSB, which was a great TV station, and trying to get the network's attention is really tough because they've got a lot of people that are trying to do that. And I got to the point where I thought either I stay in Atlanta because I don't want to go be the new guy somewhere else anymore, or I go to the network, and it just wasn't happening. I would go to New York, I would meet with people, I did a writing test at NBC, went nowhere, and finally, just out of the blue, CBS was the one place that said, well, why don't you come up here, we're going to talk to you for maybe 5 minutes. And I was lucky I had a very good friend who's a correspondent there, now based in Rome, who kind of walked me in, and that, I think, it's always good to know somebody on the inside, right? And the thing that I had worked more than a decade to try to make happen, literally within 2 to 3 days, it was an interview and then the job off. It all just, exploded in front of me in a good way. And so here I am. It took a while, and then the hard work begins, because I thought the local news was tough, but this can be a little crazy sometimes.
So they sent you to Dallas, and what happens when you start?
So the CBS tradition is to toss you into the deep end and see if you can survive it. There wasn't really much hand-holding, which is really tough coming from local, where you're not having to deal with the logistics of travel and working with different producers, and there's a certain level of writing style and of cadence and delivery that is completely different from what I was doing before. And so for the first year and a half, I walked into work completely feeling like this is a day I'm going to get fired because I don't know what I'm doing. You had editors in New York that you'd write a script that you have written like you would at any other job that you had, and then they would just return it to you just bleeding red from all the changes that they made. Sometimes they would just rewrite the whole thing, and you'd wish they would tell you what you could have done better, but there's no time. So then you just move on to the next story. But I was lucky with Mark Hooper, who you mentioned. He kind of took me under his wing. He had produced for Scott Pelley when Pelley was in the Dallas bureau. And I think he saw in me that I had maybe the potential hidden somewhere in there. And he polished it off. And since then, we've been able to do some really good coverage. When I was in Dallas, down at the border, and now that I'm in Miami, once in a while, I'll get to work with him in Latin America. And, I owe a lot to him for teaching me the ropes when no one else really did. I don't know why they do it that way, but they loved it's just the, baptism by fire, and let's see if you survive. So here I am, for now.
I've noticed that. I said something to our friend Mark about Jamie Yukas, and he goes, I know, I'm going to try to work with her. Because they do. They just throw you in.
They
and then
really do. And it's nice
to
have somebody who sees the potential in somebody and just tries to teach you the ropes. So yeah, you have Jamie Yukas now, and Ben Tracy before then, who worked here in the area as well. So it's some good connections up here, good people.
Yeah. So you were one of the first reporters on the scene at the Dallas police ambush shooting. Mm-hmm. Tell us about that.
So I happened to live 2 or 3 blocks from where this horrible incident happened. As you remember, this was a Black Lives Matter march that happened in downtown Dallas. And I had just actually gone out for a walk and took video of the march happening and posted it on Twitter, just as you would any other news event that was going on. Went up to the apartment, getting ready for dinner, and next thing I hear is just one siren after the other, and immediately your stomach just sinks because something's happened. So then it was just a matter of throwing the work clothes back on and running out the door as I'm getting the calls from New York, something's happening, what do you know? This was, I'm trying to remember, there was a big incident before. It may have been the Baton Rouge shootings or another event. And so no one was in our region. I was the only one that happened to be there. And I was out there getting videos on my phone, sending them to New York to posting on my own, and things were still fluid. They were still moving people back. They didn't know if it was one guy, if it was more than one guy, where they had him, if they had him cornered. And we talked about, I've just gone through this high-stress environment training where they're trying to train us for war zones or protests in Nicaragua or wherever, and that was one instance where you realize that sometimes it's the kind of training you need here as well, with all these horrible things that can happen from time to time.
And you said now when you hear sirens?
I don't like hearing sirens around big crowds. It makes me nervous, and that's just one of the things that, as you cover these things, there are sometimes memories that kind of trigger something, but nowhere near what other people go through when it comes to something like PTSD, not like that. But yeah, you know, you hear a siren around a big crowd, and immediately my mind goes right back to that, and it's just, you know, the way things go.
Should we maybe show one of your videos now?
Sure. I think we have a video from a story that I did with Mark Hooper, our good friend, down at the border.
The Obama administration and House Republicans remain at odds this morning over the crisis at the border, but there's one thing they do agree on, and that is trying to fast-track the deportation of thousands of young Central Americans who enter the country illegally. We wanted to learn what happens when they return home. Manuel Bojorquez just got back from a visit to El Salvador. He's with us here in Studio 57. Manuel, good morning.
Good morning. We visited a government immigration center in the capital, San Salvador. Hundreds of young immigrants who are caught in Mexico trying to reach the United States have already been deported, and there is hardly a safety net for them once they return. They arrive by the busload. Dozens of young people, some holding infants, who had packed bags and headed north. But they were caught before they could reach the U.S. and sent back to El Salvador. For security reasons, we can't show their faces. This 16-year-old fled with her 2-year-old son. It was one of the toughest decisions of my life, she said, but I'm afraid for my son because of the violence and gangs here, so I had to try. During the first 3 weeks of July, almost 1,500 deportees came through this processing center, 467 of them minors. Officials ask basic information, allow them to call a relative, then send them on their way. They return, in most cases, to the same circumstances they ran away from: entrenched poverty, lack of opportunity, and skyrocketing gang violence. El Salvador has the world's 4th highest murder rate. Zaira Navas is executive director of the country's Council for Children and Adolescents. Certainly there is violence that leads to some of the citizens leaving the country, she said, but it is not the only cause of the situation. She believes young people are being lured away by smugglers or relatives in the U.S. With all due respect, some people might say these are excuses that are being offered up for the fact that the government has really not done much to prevent the growth of these gangs, and that the violence is the reason these children are trying to leave. Is the solution to say, in order to satisfy whoever listens, the government has failed? She countered. What we should say is what we are going to do and how we are going to resolve it. That includes identifying bad neighborhoods. But instead of just a hardline police approach, she also favors prevention measures, bringing services and investments to these communities. The test will be what happens after these teenagers pass this center's gates. ¿Lo intentas otra vez? Would you try it again?
Sí.
Yes, she said. If things get worse here, I'll try again. The Obama administration has said that any minors who have made it to the United States and qualify for asylum will be allowed to go through that process, but there are concerns that speeding up the deportations will not allow for a thorough review of those cases.
Manuel, are these kids, are they traveling usually alone? Because they're not with their parents when they leave, correct?
They're not with their parents. Their parents have somehow come up with money to pay a smuggler, and then the smuggler pretty much gets a group of these kids together and tries to get them up.
And is it true that there are many rumors in these countries, too, that Obama will let these children stay in the United States once they make it here?
We did hear people talk about, yes, we have heard. There wasn't a sense that necessarily it is true, but they figured, let's take our chances.
All right, well, thank you. The Obama administration and House Republicans remain at odds this morning over the crisis at the border.
Clearly that was from
do agree on.
a while ago. That was from
fast-track the deportation of
2014.
thousands of
That was from the trip that I was able to do to El Salvador when all the unaccompanied minors, you remember when that whole phenomenon started, they were fortunate enough that CBS, yes, agreed to send us down there to find out what's the root of the problem here. Why are all these teens coming up on their own? And we found, you know, multiple instances of people who said we're being tried, the gangs want to kill us or they want to kill our families, and somebody wants us to either go be with aunt and uncle in the United States, or we just need to get out of here. And you know, for me, I think I talked about last night how it's so impactful to think that I could have been me if my parents didn't flee. Here I am interviewing, I could be on the other side of that interview very easily, and you know, just really hits you, you know.
Your mom and you as a baby and your two sisters did come back across the border. Maybe the differences about smuggling then versus what you understand now.
Right, and all this is stuff that has been told to me because I was a year and a half old, so all I was interested in is a bottle and a fresh diaper, and luckily we had those along the way. But you know, in talking to my mom, she said that at that point we were lucky enough that we had a coyote, this is what they call them, the smugglers, who seemed genuinely to care about her and the fact that she was traveling with 3 children. He tried twice to get her under the border fence, which would be easier than going around the mountains in the desert overnight, which was the other plan, but that didn't happen. She got caught twice, or we did. But she had a sense that this man really did have some degree of care about making sure that we were safe and getting across in the easiest way possible. Nowadays, the difference is that you have the criminal organizations that have decided that they want to profit off of this as well. So you have the convergence of not only people who are looking to get into the United States, but they'll smuggle drugs along with them. And then you have a very dangerous situation where these people are targets for other smugglers, or could be literally left behind if it's a matter of trying to get a shipment of drugs in as opposed to people. And so that convergence with criminal organizations is just a really unfortunate thing now, because it also affects the debate around immigration when people are saying, well, it's not just people looking to come in, they're bringing crime, they're bringing drugs behind them, and that affects a lot of border communities. If you look at the other side of the coin there, who are saying, we don't want these problems here, and that's something that we've also covered. We covered both sides of it.
So when you do cover those things, I mean, you're an immigrant.
Right.
How does that work? How do you be fair?
Fair, right. No, that's a very important question. You know, I can't control who I am. It is what it is. To a lot of people, who I am is a political thing. But you go back to the argument about, should men be covering women's issues? You know, you could go down the list of saying, well, that person probably shouldn't cover this because of this or that reason. I think at the end of the day, I'm so cognizant of the fact that I have this background, and I really do feel it's a duty as a journalist to be fair and balanced. And so I sometimes overthink it and go overboard just to make sure that what I'm presenting is as balanced as it can be. I mean, those stories speak for themselves. You're down there listening to these people's stories, and that's just what it is. And we get a lot of hateful things on Twitter every time that we cover things like that, because, you know, that's just the way that is. But, you know, you try to be as fair as you can, and realize that there's always going to be somebody saying you shouldn't be covering this, or it's not fair, not balanced. But we still have a good system in New York with CBS, where it goes through several editors who look at everything, and if there is something that just feels a little not right, we'll talk about it. And there's several layers of editing to make sure that we get it to the standards that we hope to always achieve.
You have recently been in North Carolina covering a couple of stories. One is Florence.
Right.
Tell us about that.
Florence was not fun, as any of those storms are. I moved to Miami 2 years ago, and 6 months after that, Irma hit. So now I live where these things happen, which is just no fun at all. Florence was there. You know, we talked a little bit about this yesterday. It wasn't the worst hurricane, but the flooding was it just sat there and dumped rain. And to this day, more than 2 weeks after it hit, there are still parts of South Carolina and the low country there that are still having to deal with the standing water because that much rain fell. I think that this time around, enough people got out of the way, and the federal government's response, I think most people were somewhat pleased with. They got water in. They're trying to get roads reopened and repaired. But the question will be, in the long run, I think a lot of people that we interviewed say, yes, we're going to try to get FEMA help, but they don't realize, and we say this to people over and over, that FEMA is not meant to make you whole. It's only meant to be something that is a subsidy, something that could help you. And so the long-term implications of it, I think, we've yet to really see what that's going to be like, getting people in their homes. And then there's always the question of, should you really rebuild there if it's flooded that often? And we always hear people say, we will rebuild. And you never want to ask them and be the bad guy, right? But sometimes you wonder, maybe we should rethink how we develop. Because in Houston and Harvey, you know that part of that was just rampant overdevelopment. There was no land to absorb all that rain. And I don't know that as a country we've really thought about what we're doing when we develop and build these big cities. So we'll see.
Tell us a little bit about your family.
So I have, mom and dad are still living and well. They live in Los Angeles. I have two older sisters, one in California, one in North Carolina, who I got to see, unfortunately. Not the best circumstances, but they got to see me come to work with the little nephew. And we have a large family. There are 13 children on my dad's side, because you know how that story goes in some countries. You just have as many as the Lord will give you. And 6 on my mother's side. And there's a large part of the family that is still in El Salvador that decided to stay back, and then there's a large part that's in the United States. It's so big that I have cousins that I've never met. And I think also because it's so tough to travel back and forth. Our parents go back at least once a year to visit family. My mom still has a little coffee plantation that my grandfather left to her. And we've always wanted to go back as a big, happy family and get to see everybody, and they want to bring all the nephews and nieces, and it's still a little too dangerous to do that. They don't feel comfortable doing that just yet. So hopefully soon we'll be able to all go back there and see where we came from, and also to show the younger kids where we come from. You know how it goes, right? I was lucky enough that we spoke Spanish at home, and I retained it, and it's come in so handy in a professional way. But the younger generations, it's just so hard to just get that Spanish, to really make sure that they hold on to it. So.
And your parents fled El Salvador when?
So my mother decided that it was time to get out in 1980. I was a year and a half old. My father had actually already been going back and forth. When the war broke out, initially a lot of people thought this is something that's going to blow over. These two sides are going at it, and let's just stay out of harm's way, and hopefully soon it'll blow over. There were cousins and brothers and aunts, sisters of my dad, who had already started to make the journey to Los Angeles, where they would clean houses or wash dishes, make some money to either send home or to bring back home, thinking that all these skirmishes hopefully would be done by then, but it didn't happen. So in one of those instances that my father was in Los Angeles working, the guerrillas had taken over the school that my sisters attended twice. And you had parents waiting outside these schools wondering what is going on in there. That really rattled my mother, and physically rattled her when a cab 2 or 3 cars from her exploded. And she realized, I don't know what happens to the children if I die out here on the streets. So she decided to pack everything up, get whatever money we had saved up, and go. And it's never an easy decision. One of my earliest memories is not knowing what was going on, and my grandfather on my mother's side, so her father passed away. She didn't tell them she was leaving because she knew that they would try to talk her out of it. But she knew that it was the only way to keep us safe and to give us a future. And he passed away after we'd left, about 2 years or so, and she could not go back to see him while he was sick or to even be there for the funeral. And I just remember as a child sensing this big pain or something that was going on with my mother, because she was the only daughter, and so that was a very difficult thing for her, not to be able to see him or even go to his funeral. So when we did go back to El Salvador when I was 5, when our papers were in order, we had to go back to come in legally. And I referenced yesterday how odd it was for me, because at that point my formative years had been in the United States, so it was still a culture shock, even though this is where I had just come from. But I distinctly remember not knowing where we were going, and we went to his grave, and the poor woman just fell apart. But I have those vivid memories, and I always try to tell people that, no one wants to leave home. Nobody wants to leave family behind, but the circumstances get to the point where that's your only option.
So your parents both worked in hotels?
My mom worked at the Sheraton Universal, she did, and as a housekeeper, on the weekends, she would pick up a house or two, and the funny thing is on the weekends, my two sisters and I would go and help her clean houses. So I was do the patio furniture and sweep all the outside. That was my thing. And my father worked as a valet, parking valet. And he started at a Korean restaurant as a dishwasher and then a cook. And his bosses there were the ones who gave him a little cash advance to be able to hire an attorney to figure out how to get our papers in order to see if we could become legal residents. And I made LA is such an interesting place because you have such a mix of cultures that my father makes Korean food whenever we have family functions. So we have Salvadoran family eating this like scrumptious Korean food. I love it. It's great.
You mentioned the tweets that you get.
Uh-huh.
Do you read those?
I do and I don't. I've learned that you can't read them all or you can't internalize them. Some people are just on there to antagonize and to say really horrible things. So there are times that we're in the comment section on a story or on Twitter, I just don't. And then sometimes it's like picking a scab. You do want to go read one or two and you want so badly to engage, but that's what they're looking for, so you can't. And it's just a matter of trying to control yourself because I don't think there are that many horrible people in the world, but I think that they do like to play that role online sometimes, and it's just not worth engaging. If it's it's something substantive about the story or a point that we made or a clarification that needs to be made, absolutely, we will. That's the beauty of it. You can interact with people that way. But if it's just hateful, no.
What do you think of the role of churches when you go out and do stories?
Well, it's interesting in Latin America that you talk about the journey from anywhere down in El Salvador or any other place and the way up. And we've stayed at some of these shelters before as part of our reporting, is that it's the faith-based organizations and the churches that provide a little oasis, a shelter or a place to spend a day or two before you move on to the next place that you're trying to get to. And it's so important for that migrant route. I think we were talking about it yesterday. It was almost like an underground railroad, but above ground, where you have people who along the way teach you, okay, where are you trying to get to? Well, this is the next place you want to go. And it's a priest or it's a church. And it's critical for people who are trying to make their way up because there are a lot of dangers along the way. Especially in Mexico, you could fall victim to any kinds of things. So you're a vulnerable person and there are bad people who are looking to profit off of that. And many of the ways that we research and get to a story or to find characters who are compelling, who can tell the story of what they're going through, is to reach out to the churches and say, we want to come down there to do this story. Can we spend a day there? And 10 times out of 10, they're willing to help us because they are so desperate to get those stories out there, to let people know what's going on. And it's just so important, the work that they do. And they do, these are people who are dedicated, who that's all they do. It's 24/7. They are surrounded by people who need either medical assistance or, you name it, and they're trying to figure out how to make it happen. At one shelter, we had a kid who didn't have his medicine, and I can't remember if it was ADHD or something. And this priest spent the whole day trying to figure out where in this town he could find somebody who could help him. So it's critical.
So you get the idea, I get the idea, Manny based in Miami and then gets the call, you need to be here, so he's crisscrossing the country and you have a health scare.
Oh, right, yes. This is 3 years ago that I was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin lymphoma and totally out of the blue. Whoever expects it, right? Otherwise healthy young man, and finally had gotten to the point in my career that I wanted to get to. And, full steam ahead, right? Here we go. And then I got this little pain back here that would kind of shoot up my back and then down my leg. And I decided, like any young man would, I'll just walk it off, right? It'll go away. I probably just strained something. Months later, it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. Doctors had no idea what it was. A friend said, go to a chiropractor and just try that. And it was a chiropractor of all people who said, you might want to get a scan. Let's see what's going on in there. And then it became there's a growth, there's a mass, we need a biopsy, we need to do this or that. And every step along the way, it became clearer that these doctors were kind of giving me the heads up that this may be cancer. And I survived it, so I'm blessed that way. I had chemotherapy, and I was one of the very, very lucky ones. I've been very fortunate my whole life, as you know. I can go on and on about how fortunate I've been, but the perspective during the worst parts of the chemotherapy for me were the fact that I was still going to have a job to come back to, that I could do short-term disability, and I had the insurance that was going to pay for most of this. But it was looking around at people who didn't have that network and thinking, how are they, this stuff is expensive. It's tens of thousands of dollars every time you sit down for a treatment. How do they pay for that? There were people with pre-existing conditions that had to be taken to the ER in the middle of their chemo sessions. And as bad as I felt, there was always this sense of, wow, it's so much worse for a lot of other people. I'm going to survive this and I'm going to be okay. But I think in my reporting and in that episode of my life, you always get that perspective of even in those bad times, how fortunate you are. I could complain about being up for nights in a row for work because I had to go cover the hurricane and I'm not sleeping and I don't have a hot shower or a hot meal. And then you talk to somebody who's just lost their entire home and you realize you have nothing to complain about.
So, does anyone have any questions? Yeah, if you just maybe say yours and then I'll repeat them.
So he's asking about the political situation in El Salvador. Somebody yesterday asked me about the candidates that will be running for election next year, and I was totally just, well, I don't know. I have not followed it that closely, unfortunately. And so some of my judgment of that is clouded by the fact that my parents, whenever they talk about politics in El Salvador, say, well, and the next guy's going to be just as bad as the last one, because there's so much corruption, and that's clearly the big problem, not only there, but throughout Latin America. Yes, there has to be some sort of strong government in place that cares about trying to establish order throughout the country and figuring out how to deal with the gangs. The problem with the gangs right now, from what I see, is that they're being exploited by the cartels. So they want to have these routes to get the drugs from South America through Central America and into the United States. And what I always tell people is that you always have to keep in mind that people look at the violence in Latin America and the gangs down there and think how horrible, why is this happening? Well, this is the #1 market for those drugs, the United States of America. So we are connected to that in that way. And I don't know how you go about changing that dynamic. But on the local level, I think you just have to have governments who are not able to be so easily corrupted. I mean, you look at Mexico, and that's exactly what's going on there. You need to have governments who are able to say, we're not in this for the money, we're in it to restore some sort of order here. And especially in rural parts, you talk about Colombia, and they're now having a bumper crop of coca. And it's because the government has largely ignored some of these very rural areas, and so who fills in the gap is the gangs. And so it's going to be it's a tidal wave. It's a tough one to turn around, but I think that you can't give up, right? I mean, you can't just let them take over. There always has to be just a little bit of fighting going on against that horrible thing.
Manny, how do you and your colleagues manage the phenomenon of fake news? And with the whole, the media being scrutinized probably more than it's ever been. And so how do you manage that with your colleagues?
The interesting thing is that I don't know that we change anything about what we do, because the standards we have before are the same standards we should have now. The label of fake news you can apply to anything you don't like. And that doesn't mean it's fake, it just means that it's not your point of view. you have to be careful. I think what has changed is about conversations that you might have in public, because you don't know who's listening. So if I were just to be discussing with my friends or colleagues, well, I think this senator candidate is awful and yada, 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 there's somebody hearing that, and next thing you know, Twitter is abuzz with, we just overheard, Bojorquez CBS say this or that. I think there is a degree of just being more careful about what you put online. There are some times where I rewrite a certain tweet just to make sure that I'm not seeing this way or that way. And maybe that's a good thing. The whole labeling stuff fake news that you don't agree with is not a good thing, because one of the documentaries we did for our online service for CBSN was about the murders of journalists in Mexico. It's the most dangerous country for journalists in the entire Western Hemisphere, and it's not a war-torn country unless you consider that violence war-torn. And in that kind of attack on the press, it sets a very dangerous precedent, and we've seen it used in other countries where people are now trying to discredit the press by calling them fake news. And in some countries, that will lead to attacks and deaths of journalists. So clearly, we're not at that point in this country. We hope to never be there. Anything that makes us more conscious of making sure that we are down the middle is a good thing. But the attacks on the press, I can tell you, are very are scary. I've been to rallies before where people seem to be this close to wanting to land a punch just because you're standing next to a camera. And that's not what you want this country to be. Ooh, that's a good question. People say that we can't have this, open border. It's not an open border. I've been to the border, and there are parts that are vulnerable to being breached, but there's a pretty strong wall there already, just as far as fences and stuff. Yep, go ahead.
So the question was.
Oh, sorry.
The question was.
Yeah.
How do you think immigration policy could be resolved?
I think, one, we have to acknowledge that this country has always had underclass of labor. Whether it was, back in the day of the Irish coming over or the Chinese building the railroads. When you look at Central California, which is where my sister lives, it's my people who are picking those crops for very little money with very little protection. I think first you have to acknowledge that there is a reason that this country hasn't completely shut down the border, is that it is part of the economic engine. And I think once we can recognize that, you can say, well, how then do we try to legalize or formalize the entry of these people and absorb them into society? I don't think that both sides have not been able to figure out a way to say, we are a country that needs immigrant labor. How do we get to the point where people don't have to come here illegally, or where you can streamline the process? People will say, well, go get in the back of the line and apply. Well, the back of what line? Because these are processes that take years if you'd like to come in legally. So I'm not a proponent of illegal immigration and opening the borders per se, despite my history. And I think that there just has to be a way where we can rationally say, well, it seems like we need some of these people here to be part of our labor force. So how do we do it in a way that they aren't risking their lives, and that we can be then holding people accountable for if they commit crimes, or if you want to make sure that everybody's paying their fair share of taxes, and to keep tabs on where people are and what are they doing. I think that's the conversation that probably isn't happening, because it's either you're open borders or you're anti-brown people, and that doesn't help us. It doesn't really give us a rational discussion around the issue. And then I think on the other side, somebody brought up yesterday, we should work to create places where people don't want to leave. So I think the work that you do is so pivotal in trying to make sure that people in El Salvador and other places are able to stay in their communities without feeling like they have to flee for their lives. And so what are the ways that we can do that? I know there's a lot of debate around foreign aid And once you give the aid, how do you know that it gets into the right places in the right hands, or it's not going to be mismanaged by those corrupt governments? But you know, the discussion needs to be about how do we prevent people from having to leave in the first place.
Well, it is time for us to end our session with you. It has been a joy
Thank you.
having you.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you.
And be sure and come next week. We have Ward Brem, who has written a book called Bigger Than Me. He's a local guy, and I don't know about you, but my ego definitely can get in the way of my relationship with God. So hear more from Ward about his.